just to visually show you, because I'm sure most people watching this, they may have been interested in the Islamic traditions, the Islamic, the Quran, but it's almost kind of like there's this massive barrier for them to really engage the material, and that barrier is this unapproachableness of the Arabic script, because it's so archaic. It's such an archaic script form, and this is the function. Realistically, the reason why places like that use Arabic today, the reason why they still use such an archaic script form is because of this whole history of no, we can't translate the Quran into any language. It must be, we have to stick with this. Effectively, they've been locked into having a ancient script form instead of, but that's another topic, right? But what I want to show here is something that many may have not been familiar with, which is how the Arabic script works. And JC touched on it, and that's the fact that you have a very small selection without diacritics of different consonants. So here, can you see my cursor, JC?
Yes, I can see it, and I hope everybody can see it as well. Yes.
Oh, I hope so too. So what we have here is, for example, just look at these three. We look at this one. We would call it the smiley face character, right? Based on the ta here. So this is the ta. This is the T sound. In the Latin form, it's just represented by the letter T. This one here is this the ba or the nun? JC, remind me.
Yeah, sorry, I actually just stopped myself so that you don't get any background noise. That is the ba.
Okay, I forget. Between the ba and the nun. I'm surprised that it's not even listed here. Is that strange? Or yeah, weird. Because this is the tha, this is the ta, the t, and then this is the nun, or was it the ba? I forget. It doesn't matter. The point being is that in the early Rasim, you would not have had any of the dots. The dots did not exist yet. So all you would have had is this, effectively the smiley face without eyes. Think of it like that, right? And those characters are identical. And you need to then add the dots later to distinguish between them. And this is a similar case we have for other characters here. Like take this grouping as an example here, and this grouping, and this is the dot, the D sound, and this one here, when you add the dot, becomes the DH sound. Oh wait, 1 second, let's go back. The dal, and this is the right here is the R sound, and this one is the Z sound. So these are things that for us as like an audience in most part that comes from, let's say, a Western world, let's say Latin characters is our bread and butter. We don't understand these ancient script forms. It's this massive barrier to entry for anyone to engage in the Quranic text. Like you saw with me, I'm only recently understanding the distinguishment between the ba and the nun, right? So it's about this distance that we have, and it makes it almost mystical, magical, and we can't quite make sense of it. But the reality of the situation is it's actually that the language is quite ambiguous, especially in early Rasim. So I wanted to give an example here, which I call the Latin Rasim. It's a hypothetical mock example of how the Latin characters, which the audience will predominantly be familiar with, could have hypothetically existed in the past, which would have been analogous to how the Arabic characters in the 7th century did exist. So the crucial things to note is in the early Arabic, the Quran was written in Rasim. This is what we call it. It's a skeletal script. So firstly, and this is very crucially as well, there were no vowels. So, the difference between, I can't come up with an example right away, but you can come up with your own, right? Where changing a vowel would change the word entirely, right? So we have no vowels and we have no diacritics. And these diacritics are the things we just mentioned, the dots, which change a word from being a nun to a ba, to being a ta, to being a tha, right? Which are very, very different. They're not even that similar, right? And that's the way to distinguish the different consonants. That means, this is the crucial point, is that a written word could represent multiple meanings, depending entirely how later readers supplied the dots and vowels. And we'll get into more detail about precisely the timeline here later. But effectively in the 7th century, let's say 6th, 7th century, up until somewhere around the 8th, 9th, 10th century, only in the 10th century did it get fully canonized and standardized, right? But the development of this, the diacritics, the Dhamma Kasaranpata, all of this stuff, the vowelization, this came over time. So for hundreds of years, the text effectively existed in gradual forms of ambiguous script form. And this is something that, as a audience that doesn't understand Arabic language and so forth, it seems so strange to us, and it is very strange. And we'll get into details about how that has implications as we go along. And here's the example of the Latin Rasa.
Yes, just before we move on to this one, if you could just go back one, let me just actually as well add a couple of very quick notes. One is, even though we have, we have the ba, the ta, and the tha at the top, then the nun is actually on the bottom line, and then there is also the ya. So they would look a little bit different when you look at them like this, but back in the before the diacritics, they would have looked very, very similar. For example, the ya has exactly the same initial position and middle position as the nun, the ta, the tha, and the ba. They actually look identical, and you would only distinguish them like with the dots. There is no dots. You see one of these peaks, you have no idea what it means. And then that is even without talking about writing conventions, which complicates matters even more. But did this thing happen about the adding the dots? Well, yes, and they know that full well as well. Abraham, it has two different spellings in the Quran. It's not exactly this topic, but that Aleph, it can be read as an Aleph or as a I, Ibrahim. Saint Murad, I asked him on a live stream, and he said there are 3 different spellings for Abraham because they were still adding the little dots or the little signs on the Aleph. So you can you have within the book certainly Abraham and Ibrahim, and I think he says that you have Ibrahim as well, but I haven't found it yet. So were they adding dots late? Is yes, they have it nowadays, and the proof is with Abraham. So I think that should probably give people an idea as to, yes, they were adding dots and then things change. In the case of Abraham to Ibrahim, it doesn't change the word, but the same thing would have happened with consonants, and that's when you have a big problem.
And an example came to mind, so I'll quickly mention it. So in my cursor, I'm going over here. This is the sin character. This has the sound of just the S, as we would understand it by English speakers. And this character just to the left of it, with the 3 dots added above it, this represents the shin character, and this has the sound of SH, right? So if you had this character and you had the word effectively like this character, then you had the P sound, which they don't have in the Arabic. They use the fa sound instead, right? That's where they, anyway. So if you had, let's say, this character and then the P sound, it would be like, let's say, sip. That was what I intended to say. Let's sip some beers. And then I had here, and I added the dots. All of a sudden, it becomes, let's ship some beers. And the question becomes, okay, let's talk about logistics then, right? So it makes the word entirely different. So, and this is the thing. The diacritics were not there in the beginning. So whoever added them had so much power over how the text had to be understood. And this is something we'll get into later. So to build off this idea, to make sense of it, to demystify it a little bit, I put together this hypothetical Latin rasem, I call it. So you can imagine here just this symbol here with one single vertical stroke. You could conceptualize how, and sticking only to capital characters for a second, right? That this single vertical stroke could be made into a T. It could be made into an L, or it could remain as a single vertical stroke representing the I, right? And then the double vertical stroke, hypothetically, you could join them in this way, becoming an H, or in this way, becoming an M, or this way, becoming an N, right? And then here you could see with a hypothetical curved arc, could potentially become a C, it could become a G, it could become an O, it could become a Q. So this is not overstating it. This is not like, making things up. This is quite literally akin to how the early Arabic rasem was. And this, I'm going to show a quick example that's quite lighthearted, but to make the point that for us as who are familiar with the Latin script, this is a good way of us to conceptualize analogously quite the extent of the possibility for textual corruption that is feasible if you only have rasem. So I'll just briefly mention the idea here is that you have this, like, it's badly represented in this image, but you can hypothetically look at it like this, right? So the D, B, B, and R, P and R are effectively, let's say in the Rossum, would be a vertical line and then a little bit of a hook, almost like a hand axe or like a pickaxe cut in half, that kind of shape. And you can see how that could then be rendered into a B or a D or a P or an R. So this is just, this is nothing concrete or important necessarily to, don't take notes on this, guys. This is just a mock-up. So using this mock-up, let's take the very simple sentence, Jesus is God. So if the Jesus is God, you would firstly, let's say, take the word God, you would cut out the vowel, right? There's no vowels in the Rossum, okay? So there is no O. You just have GD. But worse yet, you don't actually have GD. What you actually have is the Rossum moon, like half moon shape, which could become a C, could become a G, could become an O, not an O, let's leave that out because that's a vowel, right? Could become a Q. And the D, so you have GD, the D could be a R, could be a P, could be a B, right? So you can imagine now you have this like semi-shape like this, effectively, like a half moon shape, and then you have this pickaxe shape. That's all you would have in the Rossum if you had this analogous version in our Latin Rossum example. So therefore, if you added the Diacritics, the analogous version of the Diacritics in our case, you could not read Jesus is God. It could now be Jesus is cob. And now we went from talking about the divine and suddenly we're talking about corn. And we go from high Christology to high carbohydrates, right? And I know this is all, it's quite silly. And it's just to make the point. The point is to show you, as someone who's more familiar with a Latin script, how something can so radically change on the level of consonants and also on the level of vowels. So hypothetically, it could also not be read as, the vowelization of the O that comes later to make it cob could also have been vowelized as an A. And now you have Jesus's cab. And now he's a cabbie in New York, for example, right? So this is an analogy to break down the mystical nature of this boundary that we as Latin familiar people or Latin script familiar people have, and that the Arabic language is so foreign to us. I'm trying to show how ambiguous, the true extent of the ambiguity that existed in the 7th century Arabic script for hundreds of years. So that's just a quick example to illustrate this point and drive it home for the viewers to see the true realm, the true space that existed here for corruption. And
yeah, actually, before we move on, let me just say something about that. Yes, you're right. It actually sounds like silly, but Kash and I, we know better. We are actually introducing this because we have seen examples of something as ridiculous as this in the actual Quran.
right.
And as we introduce more of the material and we show we have to do it one step at a time, we will get to some particular verses in the Quran which currently they make no sense, but we've never paid attention to it because they have explained it away. They've said, oh yes, this means that thing, but actually it doesn't. It becomes a very silly verse which makes no sense. However, once we understand how the Aramaic became the Arabic in the Quran, we start joining the dots and we start saying as well these parallels. Okay, so this rasam is here, here, and here. Let's just take it together and see what it means. And things like this level of silly, they actually appear in the Quran, which we will show. And once we do the reverse, you will see how then it makes sense. I mean, if we say Jesus is cop, you will say, well, that is silly. Yes, but we have similar things in the Quran right now. Imagine that you have this in the Quran, and then we show how the language actually moved from Aramaic to Arabic. And by taking it back, we say this was meant to be read, Jesus is God. Then you will say, oh, now it makes sense. Before it
Right.
didn't. So this is
And
the reversal that we're trying to do. There are quite a few things in the Quran which actually they make no sense as they stand, and we will show the real meaning. But at the moment we have just accepted the very silly rendering, and we have to really destroy that, and we will have to do it one step at a time because there are many different aspects. That's why we're going to introduce them slowly, showing different problems, as opposed to just going with the very big one, and we have to speak for hours and hours and hours for one concept. So we're introducing them slowly. But this, as silly as it sounds, in a few shows you are going to think that it is actually not that silly and pretty much spot
It's
on.
pretty reasonable then. Like, for example, JC, if I told you Jesus is cob, Jesus is cab, or I told you Jesus is ear, it's just as silly, right? It's just as silly. And we'll get into that later. That's just a quick joke for JC there.